Timmins is with is a company called SynergyGRC, and focuses very much on GRC solutions, information security, business continuity management. Stephen has 20 years experience in across a wide range of business sectors, being state-owned NGOs, public sector, mining and extraction, transport and storage industry sectors, and as I say, has a vast knowledge around business continuity, disaster recovery. So we actually thought Steve and I, or BarnOwl, have been speaking for quite some time, and we thought there's always this debate or confusion around risk management and how does that fit into BCM, or rather how does BCM fit into risk management, and also a case of what's the difference between BCM and disaster recovery. People often think that's the same thing. So we thought today would be a very good idea to have this session for Steve to explain what BCM is all about, and then also I will also present 1 or 2 slides in terms of how BCM could be supported or enabled with a system such as BarnOwl. So Steve, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much for your time this morning, and we're looking forward to a great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Also from my side, also honoured to be working with you, and it's been good to get to know you over the last period of time, going through all these ideas and discussions around business continuity and risk. And good day to everybody else who's listening in. Welcome to you all. I hope you enjoy the session. I do know we've got time at the end for questions. Jonathan, am I correct? We can have a bit of a chat around things. Those who want to stay on.
Yes, and no problem. Yeah.
Okay, so is my screen sharing okay? I just want to double check.
Yes, I can see your screen, Steve. No, now it's gone.
Yeah, I just want to share again.
Okay.
Sometimes it freezes for some reason. I'm not sure why.
We can see it now.
Yeah,
we can see it.
Okay, so if you look at the agenda, then the first part of it is I'm going to be talking about planning for potential business disruptions. And then that's the second session is where Jonathan comes in with his overview of the BIA with threat and risk assessments using BarnOwl. And then finally, I'll come back again and talk a bit about embedding BIA and the BCM processes. And then we'll have a bit of time there for questions. So if you look at the world we live in, I'm sure you'll agree it's a closed and connected complex system. And obviously, if you look at those different areas over there, food security, ecosystem decline, deforestation, climate change, etc., their material resource scarcity, population growth. There's a number of areas that all these at the moment impact in different ways on our businesses, and there are threats involved in those. Of course, when the threats come from the outside and affect us and impact on our businesses across different areas. And I'm sure I don't want to dwell too much on COVID, as I'd like to look beyond COVID today, but obviously you're all aware of how these things are beginning to impact more and more as we go through this difficult phase at the moment. So we need to be aware of these things, but we do live in a closed and connected complex system, and we have to every day realize it and keep an eye on what's going on around us in our businesses. And in some ways, look at horizon scanning as being something important, that we look at the horizon scanning ahead of us and say, well, okay, what are the threats out there that we can visualize, and what are the opportunities, and how do we address them, and how do we look at the impacts on our business? So that's quite important because of that we do that. If we look at some interesting factors, I don't know if you know much about the Bering Sea, but if you look at that diagram, you'll see where those 2 blue arrows are up and vertically and horizontally there in the red line. That's where the ice was up to 2019. From 2013 to 2019, it just disappeared. So if you can imagine that whole blue area being white, that was actually blanketed in ice, and it's not anymore. And this is just an example from a climate change point of view. And it's caused profound impacts, widespread actually. Unprecedented weather events, a lot of marine life has died. There's been sighting of animals outside their normal ranges, ecological changes, mass strandings of seals, redistribution of sensitive fish, etc., and a die-off of seabirds due to starvation. That's just one idea, one aspect of what's going on from a climate change point of view. And yeah, quite frightening when you look at that. Going a step further, if we look at the world population over the years from 1945 and the predictions up to 2050, we're looking at 11 billion people being on this wonderful planet of ours. And what are the impacts there? Well, again, those are the threats, but what are the impacts? Service delivery challenges, rocketing care costs, youth unemployment, poverty and inequality, conflict and unrest, disease and malnutrition, resource consumption, and insecurity from a food point of view. So again, these things are there, and at all times we have to consider these impacts on our business. Interestingly enough, sorry, my screen's frozen again. There we go. If we look at the global risk landscape in 2020 in these 4 quadrants, it's good to look at the top right-hand side, where you'll see these ones over here on the top right have got the highest likelihood and the highest impact. And I'm sure you'll recognize some of these at the moment: biodiversity, climate action failure, etc., cyber attacks. What's interesting though, if you look at the infectious diseases over here, it was on the left. And of course, I'm now sure if you look at it right now, it's probably moved over here to the right. And if you look at cyber attacks, during this period in the last, since March, the cyber attacks in South Africa increased by 33% in the main due to COVID-19. So as you can see, these are ongoing things that affect us all the time. So looking at the population growth, looking at these things from a perspective of global risk, and moving forward now, how does it look for the next 18 months? Well, some of you might like to get hold of this. It's an interesting document that the World Economic Forum put out. It's an 18-month view going forward of a post-COVID world, based on the opinions of 347 senior risk analysts. So if you look to the top left as I go around there on that circle, you can see some of the things they're talking about. And what I've done here is highlighted the highest ones we could find: prolonged global recession, bankruptcies and restructuring, high unemployment, restricted travel and trade, weakening of major companies, prolonged supply chain disruptions, emerging market collapse, remote working, cyber attacks, and possibly another disaster of a pandemic, which you already see if you look at the news this morning. Boris Johnson's already saying they're worried about a second wave in the UK. So if we look at all these things then in context, we need to look on the bright side, I guess, as well, because many experts are saying that this is a time for a recovery strategy to be put in place in our companies. In other words, looking forward and saying, well, okay, this is where we are now, but let's make an opportunity of this to do a great reset of our businesses and, of course, the global systems. So there's some positive aspects to this. And, you know, in South Africa, I believe we have this here so that we can do these things. You know, it's something that always excites me about this country and the challenges we face. We do get beyond them. And I think we need to look at this opportunity to reset our businesses. So if we took these things now into the context and just broke them down a bit easier, if we look at what comes from that analysis, obviously from a human perspective, a possible another outbreak of COVID, definitely a technology overload, cyber attacks and data fraud due to sustained shift in working patterns. I don't know if any of you use Garmin at all. I use Garmin for my gym work and running and stuff. I had no access to Garmin for the last 7 days. because they had a ransomware attack. So it's amazing how these things are spreading. Further restrictions on travel and trade movements, higher risk of failing to invest enough in climate resilience and adaptation, and job losses and prolonged recession. Excuse me. What's also interesting is, because I don't talk as much as I used to since the lockdown, I get a dry throat when I chat. So it's even affecting that with me. Okay, so those are some of the threats we can see right now facing our businesses. So what is business resilience? Because that's really something that gets spoken about a lot. And if you speak to BCM practitioners these days, everyone's talking about business resilience and what is it? And if you look at it, really, it's the ability to recover from setbacks, adapt well to change, and keep going in the face of adversity. Pretty much what I said just now. But what I find a lot of the time is BCM tends to be closeted. It tends to be put into a box. And I don't think it should be, because I think it's a lot more than that. And if we look at this, these couple of points down the bottom of these little diagrams, what happens with this really is, if you look at the people in the business, they end up having this huge pressure upon them every day of things that are weighing them down, what's going on outside in their lives and inside in the business. At the end of the day, you think you're carrying this huge elephant on you everywhere you go. But it really shouldn't be like that, because it really is an across the business approach. And after this next slide, I'll show you a bit more on that. But to bring it back into context, business resilience, it's really it's a high level thing, okay? Because it's involved with governance and risk. It's not really something that happens with BCM practitioners doing their work with business continuity plans, etc., and looking at BIAs in relation to those. It's actually a higher level. It should be addressed at a board level. And because to survive and thrive in a hostile environment, they really don't have a lot of choice but to look at it at that level. And so if we look at the two aspects of business resilience, on the one side, you've got business continuity, which is your systems and processes ensuring you can maintain your operations if an event occurs. And of course, on the right-hand side, the disaster recovery aspect of it, which is actually a subset of business continuity, focusing on recovering IT and systems. And we've heard a lot of that in the last couple of months about disaster recovery due to ransomware attacks, etc. So that's the context when we look at it. Excuse me. Look at the next slide, though. It goes a step further. Because in actual fact, and this is from ICOR, International Consortium of Organizational Resilience. Very good to look up on the web if you don't already know of them. They see business continuity as a total business approach. It covers all sides of the business from all angles. And you can see from those headings there on the left, if you would go from left to right, from a business continuity, crisis management, critical environments, financial health, human resource management, ICT continuity, incident response, etc. I don't want to go into all of them, but you can see it covers all parts of the business. So that's why it needs to be seen as an all parts of the business strategy aligned to risk, enterprise risk. Because if you look at enterprise risk, you'll probably see enterprise risk sitting at the top of this diagram as an umbrella. If you look at that roof there, that's how enterprise risk is seen, and that's the way it is. And of course, business continuity is an element of that. But I think what we need to understand is that it's a much bigger element than it tends to get made out to be. So if we look at some of the threats then facing our businesses and their impact. So we saw from that previous diagram I showed you from WEF, you've got the trade movement restrictions, pandemics, possible job losses, cyber attacks, data fraud, and extreme weather opportunities. That's an interesting one, by the way, because what they're saying now is that from some of the research I've done is that everyone's actually putting less focus on ESG and they've taken their focus away from it because of what's happened with the pandemic. And I guess it's a warning that we need to actually not forget about it, because it's actually, if you look at the 6 capitals of ESG, it's very much again a business-wide approach of how you look at it. So, but it is something I've heard that needs to be addressed and not forgotten about. So, if we look at what a disruption does, if you look at, that's a nice picture of the red arrows there. One of my favorite air display teams. One of them's just shot across there and caused a disruption in the turbulence there. And what are the impacts then? So if we look at them, you've got things like supply chain interruption, a huge issue when it comes to trade movement restrictions. Compromised worker health and safety because of the pandemics. Loss of staff and staff morale, job losses and recession. On the left, if you look at the right, loss of staff and staff morale. Data loss and corruption. And possible restricted access to facilities due to extreme weather. So those are the type of impacts which occur within our business because of the threats that we're faced with. So if we look at why impacts an important point to consider, there's three main things if we look at an impact on a business that we need to understand. What I like about the impacts aspects of it, when you look at it from that point of view, is it's associated with the process and the assets that are key to the business. So that's the first thing that's very important. The second thing about impacts, because you're looking at it objectively, it means you're going to get a far less subjective view of what that impact can have on your business. And even more importantly, knowing them assists in corporate strategy and policy development. So those are the three key things that are so important about business impacts on businesses. Sorry, I've just lost sharing for some reason. Oh, excuse me. Something's happened there, Jonathan. I'm not quite sure what's happened.
We can see your email.
It's not my email, I don't think.
Okay.
Someone else's email. Yeah, okay, there we are. Is it back?
Okay, you're back. Okay, good.
I'm not sure what happened there, so terribly sorry. Okay, so as I said, the impacts then becoming an important point of focus, why they are so important, because of those three things that I just mentioned. What is also key to this as well is that if we look at these five blocks here, we'll see why these things are important again. And why do we need to do a BIA? First of all, it determines the impact on a business when processes are not functional. So it's not looking at the threat at all. It's looking at purely at the process when it's not functional for any reason. It doesn't matter what the reason is or the threat. It's based on an inability to perform a process. It identifies how quickly the process must be available. And it's concerned with when a process needs to be available. And of course, also importantly, it determines what technology or planning is needed for functional recovery. So those really are the 5 reasons why it is so important to do a impact analysis. If we look at it from a BIA assessment point of view, and I enlarge this here for you, obviously that behind this enlargement, you'll notice a very large assessment. I cannot show all of it, obviously, because there's quite a lot involved in it. What I've done is highlighted the 4 main points that are important to understand when you're looking at a BIA. So the first thing is the business disruption. And in this case, employees unable to swipe their access card of security. What are the dependencies? Well, accessing the system is a dependency, but there's an impact in this case if it can't happen of 5,000 Rand from a quantitative point of view. And from a qualitative point of view, the time taken to sign people in manually. So what one has to do when you get to the risk assessment, which we'll talk about in a while, one needs to consider from a BIA point of view, what are the aspects in the BIA we need to draw in to the risk assessment? And what I've highlighted here are some of the main things one would look at when looking at it from a risk point of view later. So this is purely the assessment from a business impact analysis perspective. If we look at the recovery strategy, moving from the left to the right, the first thing you're going to have in a situation with a recovery is you want to put in implementation measures and activities to lessen the impact. So going from the left to the right there, you'll see you're doing the preemption, you're looking at reducing for your recovery strategy, but then disaster strikes. And of course, when disaster strikes, that's when you've got a timeline of an occurrence. And if you look at it from a business impact aspect, looking from the left, the first point is where it's the last viable restore point. So that's the last point where you were able to restore. And then your recovery point objective there, the RPO, as it's known, gives you definite data loss. In other words, but in that timeline, you know what you're going to lose, whatever it might be. Obviously, the green arrow at the bottom there is implementation measures and activities you want to put in to lessen the impacts on that period of time, so that you'll be able to get back to respond to that within minutes and hours, or hours or days, depending on what's gone wrong, obviously. So that's the period of definite data loss. You know you're going to lose that amount of information, and that's why it's important to do the BIA properly, because you can determine what that is going to be should that process or whatever it is go down. Then moving on from there, obviously, the next step is how quickly we respond to that. And that's where you've got your system downtime and potential further data loss. So when we move to the red line, the third red arrow going down there, it's really what we call getting back to as near as normal. That's what we're doing there. We're not necessarily back to exactly where we were before, but we're trying to get back to as near as normal. And then obviously the last arrow on the right hand there, within weeks to months, restore and return back to normal. So that's what you're really looking at from a BIA perspective. And obviously your recovery strategies, etc., are something you'd look at more in your business continuity plans. But that gives you an idea of the sort of timeline and how the approach works. So if you look at the two, a BIA and a risk, what's the difference, and why is it important that we look at both? Okay, so from a BIA perspective then, we're looking at criticality and sensitivity of assets and resource classification. And what is the output from the BIA? Well, it's going to give us a strategy for business continuity and recovery, criticality, prioritization, etc., RTOs and RPOs. And there's a number of other techniques you can use. I've just used those two because those are the most commonly ones used in BCM. And then if we're looking at it from a risk assessment point of view, what are we looking at as inputs there? We're looking at the threats, the assets, and the vulnerability. And the output then is your impact, likelihood, countermeasures, and controls. Okay, so those are the two sides to it really, and there is a lot of debate in again, like there always is, that should you do the risk assessment first, or should you do the BIA first, or whichever way is the best for you. But in my opinion, and I've sort of got to that view, the BIA, in my opinion, is the thing you should do first. And then because it's giving you that objectivity, because you're looking at the impacts, when you do your risk assessment, it's much easier to align when you're looking at the threats and assets and vulnerability, because you know already what the impact's going to be on the business should any one of those three occur. Okay, so once again, looking at threats from a risk point of view, I'll put some more in here now because we're going to go through a similar process. Again, some of the things we can see in business at the moment, trade restrictions, things like product recalls, malicious outsiders and insiders, epidemics, flood, etc. Once again, technology overloads, theft and arson, vandalism and riot, civil unrest from a physical point of view. And once again, from an environmental point of view, social, economic, and legal concerns. So then if we look at risk assessments then, if we look sort of also ISO 31000 2018 as well, one of the things I've noticed a lot in some of the companies I deal with is they haven't really thought about the aspect of strategy, because you can't really do anything with a risk unless you know what your strategic objectives are according to your internal and your external stakeholders. And you can't really deal with internal and external stakeholders unless you've looked at it from a constructive board engagement approach. So once again, high level thing, linking those objectives then to obviously looking at your risks. So, and then how are you positioning yourself against those threats and impacts from a risk point of view? Also, one needs to have a strong risk culture within the business, across the business, that people understand what risks they are exposed to, and obviously involving people at all levels. A commitment to implementation of the policies. Obviously, policies aren't things that just get written and hidden away. They should be something we live by. They should contain the values that the business implies in the way it does things, etc., ethics and all the other good things that goes with it. But it's important that everybody's committed to those policies and they see it as part of their work. And then, of course, the other point I want to raise as well, and is a desire to embed BCM in the culture of that organization. So if we look at a risk assessment once again from a threat and risk point of view, and this is where I must say Jonathan and myself have had a lot of healthy discussions around how his tool can allow for these things, and I must say, take my hat off to him. He's made a success of building something, which he's going to show you just now. But if we look at the aspect here, what we're saying is we're looking at the threat on the left. So you can see now, let's say it's a power outage. Once again, I've brought in those two areas of the disruption and the qualitative impact, employees unable to swipe, etc. And then we've also got the information types that also may be affected. And you've got the aspect there of security clearance checks and information being affected. And we've looked at a risk decision of reduce. On the second one there, we've marked it as higher because we've said it's an IT system crash and it's affecting your accounting records, invoices, and bills and accounts. And the risk decision there would be to develop a BCP. So we've said in our risk assessment that we need to develop a BCP. So a BCP needs to put in place to reduce the possibility of that inherent risk level to a lower level. Without further ado, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, who's going to continue with his part of the presentation before I come back to you on the last part.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks. Do you mind moving to the next slide, please? Okay, so I think most of us that are familiar with ISO 31000 and the COSO framework. So if you look at the wheel in the middle there, we're very familiar with objectives, setting objectives in the organization, the traditional, what are the risks that threaten the objectives, what are the risks that you take to achieve objectives, and there's a lot of discussion around opportunity versus risk management. Then it's a case of doing a risk assessment, which is how do you rate your risks, so that you can focus in the right areas. And then in terms of the risks that you manage, which ones can you manage, and to put controls in place. There are various aspects around risks as well as to what are the contributing factors, what causes the risk. The bow tie methodology is also a very clever methodology around causes of risks and treating the causes. And then once you know what your risks are or have an idea as to the impact and likelihood and the severity of risks, you can actually then rate your controls, but also manage your controls. And managing controls involves action plans. If you look at this, execution and monitoring. And then we also talk about different lines of defense. The audit is one of the lines of defense. And obviously does a lot more detailed assurance around controls. There's also a big element more and more that we're seeing that we're very involved with is continuous auditing, where you've got robots sitting in the data, analyzing information and feeding those triggers, basically key control indicators, back into BarnOwl from products such as Arbutus, which is the continuous auditing tool that we work with. So what if you move to the left-hand side here, the process tree. So what dawned on me was, how does BIA or how does BCM fit in then with risk management? So when Steve and I were discussing things, BIA stands for Business Impact Assessment. And what I do like about the BIA approach is that it's very objective. So it's a case of looking at all your processes within the organization, your assets, and assets could be things like products, services, clients, suppliers. It's not just processes. So it's processes, resources, assets. So almost like a combination of all the things in your organization that make your organization work, and working out what are the most important, how are these processes interrelated, and what are the critical areas within these processes that need to be operational for you to stay in business. So if you document all your processes, and then these processes are superimposed on top of your organizational structure. So wherever you've got a big organization, where you've got, like in this example, we've got ABC Corporation, we've got Cape Town, Durban, East London, Joburg. Most organizations that we deal with are big organizations, and they have multiple sites. So these processes that you've identified exist in different areas across your organization. You might have 2 or 3 manufacturing plants, across the country. You might have different kinds of processes operating in different areas of the country. Some processes are full processes, some are partial processes. So it's a case of, if you look towards the right here, you would see that you've now got a cross section of all your processes and sub-processes, and the columns here, just a standard chart here, the columns here are actually the business units. In other words, where do all these processes exist, and how are they rated from an importance perspective? So within your BIA, you can rate the importance of processes at every level of the organization. Then you would go and do a risk assessment. So once you've identified what are the processes, you then go and work out what are the threats. I know there's a big debate between risk versus threats, but when I was looking at a lot of the material that Stephen sent through to me, it's very easy to populate BarnOwl with the threats as risks. So linked to these processes, you have a whole lot of risks, and then you can identify where your high risk areas are compared to where your the BIA key areas are as well. So it's a cross section. So maybe if you could move to the next slide, Steve, please. So I know it's a bit of an eye test here, but this is a BIA. So if you looked at, you can see the processes, and there's an objective ranking basically. In other words, how do we rate these processes? How important are they? What is the recovery points objective, recovery time objective, business disruption? So you can document all of this in a system like BarnOwl, and again, it can be at these processes can occur in multiple areas of your organization, and in some places that might not be a key process in Durban, but it is a key process in Joburg, for example. So you can have different ratings for your processes across your organizational structure. If you don't mind the next slide, please. And that's just similar to what Steve had shown in Excel earlier, was that these are, for example, the key fields around your business, the BIA, the Business Impact Assessment. So if you move to the next slide. Steve?
I have.
Oh, there you have, yeah. So if you look at the heading of this slide, Business Impact Risk Assessment using BarnOwl with a BIA focus. So you will see that There now are the processes, or your BIA is that first line there, facilities and security, the process being access control, and we've identified a risk or a threat, which is power outage. And then it's a case of rating your risks inherently and residually, and assigning controls to that. In other words, putting in generators or whatever you would have to do. So the starting point in this case was, what are the key processes? How important are they? And what are the threats to those processes? So obviously, power outages the nice thing about a system is that you're not going to capture a power outage 50 times over. You put that power outage in once, and you can assign that to the different processes or BIA areas that power outage is going to affect. And you know that if you controlling that power outage in one particular area, that it's going to address these particular processes. So it's in a system, it's nice in that you can have libraries of standard processes, standard risks, and then it's how those are interrelated with one another at every area of your organization. So you can have different owners at every single area of your business unit of your organization who's responsible for managing a power outage, for example. So in Durban, you might not have a generator. In Joburg, you have got a generator. So there's just another. This is now turning, that's the BIO focus. If you move to the next slide, Steve, as you had. This is now, if you look at the heading here, it's a risk focus. So now it's just turning that on its head. We've now got the power outage is the risk. So there's your risk assessment and how you're rating that. There's the control, but that risk or threat, if you want to call it, is linked to this particular process, which comes from the BIA, which is what and as Steve says, you can start with risk assessments, but it also makes a lot of sense to start with a business impact assessment in terms of what are your key processes or your assets or your resources. How do you rate those in different areas? And then what are the risks that threaten those? And how are we going to actually control those? So that is the link between BCM, and I'll call it BIA, Business Impact Assessment, and risk management. And there's an overlap with setting, because another way of doing this is to set your objectives. If you look at the ISO or COSO frameworks, it's all about setting what are the objectives at every level of the organization, and your objectives, one of your objectives is to stay in business and to make sure that you are that you document what are the main things in your business that keep a business running, not all about surviving, but also about thriving. But in this case, at the moment, we're probably all surviving a bit, but documenting your objectives or your processes, there's a bit of an overlap, and identifying what are the threats or risks to those processes and how we're going to manage that. And if you move to the next slide, obviously, if you've got a system, there's your reporting becomes the whole idea of putting information into a system is to get intelligent reporting out of a system. So, here are just a couple of dashboards showing, per area of your business, where the residual risk rating of different areas. This little spider chart here on the left shows you by category of risk, whether you're within risk appetite or not within risk appetite. And then the overlap, if you look at this Cape Town, Durban, Joburg with the blue lines, those are all processes that are, and your BIA, overlapping with the risk rating in the different areas. So on the right-hand side here, we've got qualitative and quantitative rating of risk. So we see more and more organizations, if you start putting RAND values against your risks, it definitely gets the attention of management and exco. When things are a little bit subjective in terms of impacts and likelihoods, they can sometimes just be overlooked. But adding RAND values to that's very important. We'd all be very familiar with heat maps, impacts, likelihoods, by category with full sort of drill down into trends. So trends are very important as well. Within, you can trend your controls to see which controls are effective, which ones aren't, where they're effective, where aren't they, but also your risks, how your risks moving, over a period of time. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Which processes are working? Which ones are going wrong? With a little bit of predictive analysis. Obviously trends don't always predict things, but if you do see that certain areas are progressively getting worse, then trends, the next step, if you don't do anything about that, then that does become a bit predictive. And on a last note, I think to bring this all together, which is my hobby horse, is to make risk management a living system. You need action plans. In other words, you've got to have people doing something about these problem areas. And the other big important thing, which we're seeing more and more, is if you are capturing key risk indicators, key control indicators, and key performance indicators, those are actually measures. So it takes out the subjectivity of risk management. You need to put targets, thresholds, and what you're trying to achieve, and then actually measure those. So if you look in a municipal environment, which I really like, they talk about an SDBIP, a service delivery implementation plan, and they've got targets every single quarter. How many electricity meters, how many water meters, how many this, how many that. Those are classic key performance indicators or key risk indicators. And by measuring those, you will see that your risks, if they're rated green, and you're nowhere near your targets and meeting your KPIs or KRIs, then you know that you're out of sync with reality. And that is one of the problems with risk management. It's too subjective a lot of the time. And what I do like is the BIA is far more objective, rating your processes objectively, but also then bringing in KPIs, KRIs, and KCIs and monitoring those against your risks. So yeah, thanks, Steve. I think I'm going to leave. I think you're going to wrap up the next slide and pull it all together. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so moving on. I can hear an echo now for some reason. That's gone now. Okay, so just to talk through this, a bit of background on this diagram before I get into the detail. This is something that comes from the BCI. I don't know how many of you online are members of the BCI, Business Continuity Institute in the UK, but I'm a member. And it's basically something I got from one of their documents I found in their library, something that was addressed back in 2008 when the previous crash happened, which I'm sure you all remember, the Enron and everything else that went with it. And this was an example they used, a company where they put these processes in, and they were able to weather the storm through that process far easier than anybody else because of what they put in place. And it was actually a bank, I won't mention the name, but it was a bank that actually did this. And from my point of view, I think it's a great approach, which we should consider today with the things we're faced with. So it's something that you can sort of build into a wider governance framework as well. So if you've already got a corporate governance framework in place, which I'm sure some organizations online have, you can also build this in. So if we look from the top there, from the left-hand top side there, I've marked it with the white square there. What you're looking at there is the corporate strategy and development and understanding the business model. Now, obviously, that's going to happen all the time. I mean, that's something you should be doing all the time, looking at what is our business model going forward. And I think that changes. And I think that's the challenge of today, the challenging times we live in going forward. It means we've got to adapt and change quickly. Our business model can change all the time. It's a live thing. It's something we should be reviewing regularly. It's not something you can just have in place and leave it there for 5 years and review it 5 years later. We have to look at it on an ongoing basis. So if we look at the next step, prior to any risk assessments, okay, what are our critical processes and assets in our business. And again, that's something that should be considered at that level. And if we look at it from that point of view, what of these assets and processes underpin our business, and also, according to our shareholders, adds the greatest value? And once you've got that in place, you can present that back to the board. Now, that's normally the exco that would do that from a governance point of view. You wouldn't expect the board to do that, but the exco would probably do that and present that back and say, well, this is what we've identified, and this is how we see it based on our investigations. And we believe in this particular time, these are our critical processes and assets. And then only then really start saying, well, okay, look, from a business impact point of view, look at it and say, okay, we've identified those processes and assets that might not be available at this time if something does go wrong. And how quickly then can we ensure that the investment that we need to make, what we need to put into this for recovery, can be put in place? So again, it's looking at your budget as well, in a sense, because obviously I think a lot of the things that happen these days are reactive. I was chatting to someone in the forensics industries recently who was saying to me they want to be more proactive than reactive in what they do. And I think that's a good way of putting it. And I think, being proactive means that we're looking at it from that point of view. We're looking ahead, horizon scanning again, knowing what those critical processes and assets are, and saying to ourselves, from a time frame point of view for the sustainability of our business, we have to spend some money on this to make sure that it's sustainable should something go wrong. And obviously, this would involve people like your senior members. And this is where what I like about this is that this is where we elevate BCM, because you'll normally find that the business continuity practitioners operate at a lower level than this. But what we're saying here is that they should be operating at a higher level and should have some representation at that executive level, along with the specialist practitioners in some form of committee or group or team, etc. And obviously, from there, you're going to develop your business continuity practices that you need to consider. Then the next interesting point is, and this is what they did with this 2008 study, they actually put together an impact policy. In other words, they said, this is our policy, how we look at impact on our business. And they put together a whole policy with procedures, etc., explaining how they would go about looking at the impacts on the business on a regular basis. So it takes it, again, it elevates it a step further to what it would normally be. And what's interesting now, no one's asked for a risk assessment yet. We haven't got to the risk assessment yet. We're getting there, and it's coming, but we haven't got to it yet. What we've done now is identify and isolate what drives the value in the business and agree what we should focus on to maximize the uptime to our processes or access to those processes and assets should there be something that goes wrong. Then we come to the risk assessment and we start looking and saying, right, what, from that point of view then, what risk can we identify right now based on what we're seeing from those impacts, and from a threat point of view, how do we deal with them from a vulnerability, from an asset, from a threat point of view? And then moving down, we get to the point where we look at our business continuity strategy, and this is very more the specialists coming in again, but once again, specialists from both levels involved in this, operational and organization, looking at the strategy of developing and implementing the BCM response. And then the last point there, and this is the one where, and I understand why a lot of companies don't like this, because obviously when you're doing an exercise or a test or review or whatever, it takes time. If you're going to do a proper test of your BC plans, it takes time to do them, and it takes a large investment because people have to stop their work and get involved in examples and tests and simulations and things like that. They are expensive, but again, it needs top level support so that you can regularly do them to once again make sure you're able to deal with those impacts correctly. It can also be a pointer from a horizon scanning point of view to indicate back to the board, you need to think about this more. And then lastly, if you look at the segments around the outside of that diagram, it effectively supports the whole framework. And it shows you that you can embed that BCM practice throughout the organization, better stakeholder communication, and an evolving business continuity management framework. So that's what embedding BCM with the culture is all about. And yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's great. I think we're going to open up the floor now. I think it's going to work best if you put your hand up, but we have got some time, so whoever would like to stay on the call is welcome. We will make this presentation available on our website, and we'll probably, well, I don't think we've got everyone's email, but certainly it'll be available on the website, and we'll send out an email just with a link to it. But yeah, let's open the floor to some questions. Thank you very much, Stephen, for today. It's very a great presentation, and also I've learned a hell of a lot over the last good few months engaging with you and understanding. You know, I'm more, the devil's always in the detail, and I've learned a lot now in terms of how we would integrate BIA with risk management, and practical examples with all the information that you and I have shared, and how we've populated that. And so I think, you know, it's BCM and risk management go hand in hand, and BCM now more than ever is probably more important. If you look at, as you say, the cyber attacks, I mean, that's just one aspect, but we're all struggling a little bit with our businesses, and we're all going to have to, it's never too late to put BCM plans in place, and never too late to work out where the critical processes are in our organization and what the risks are going forward and how we could manage those. So yeah, thank you very much for your time today, Stephen, and please, if anyone would like to ask some questions, just use there's a little hand on this Teams thing. You can put your hand up. I think that's going to work best, and then unmute yourself to ask a question. Manana, go for it.
Thanks, Jonathan. I just wanted to find out if there is a guide for capturing the BIAs into BarnOwl.
So I think what we'll do after this is I will share with you some of the information that as to how we've done it, how Stephen and I have worked with the methodology to do it. So maybe what we could do is, if you don't mind sending us an email afterwards, and we'll then engage with you directly on that. Patricia?
Thank you.
Hi, I just want to find out, so you only go up to the BIA, you do not create plans within BarnOwl?
So there is the BIA, and you can document that, and then it's more around what are the risks that threaten those processes. And I suppose when you say no, wouldn't, so the only plans would then be what are the controls and what are the action plans. In terms of disaster recovery plans and things like that, that would be outside of BarnOwl, and it's quite a specialist area. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen. You would know more about that than myself.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you've got it, if you can have something that comes out as a report from a risk and a BIA point of view, your BIA and your risk assessment is part of the BCP. So from that point of view, you could look at it from there. But I don't. The rest of what, like the things like the recovery plan and all the other things that go into a BCP, wouldn't be part of that. No.
Are you looking at maybe enhancing it further as we go down the line, or is you just going to stop at the BIA?
Well, it's BIA plus risk management, plus the management of the risks. So no, I don't think at this stage, you know, that's where we would stop at the BIA, where you can document your key processes and assets, and then what are the risks and the controls. So really within the focus of risk management. If you'd like to after this ask more specific questions, because maybe we're missing each other a little bit. When you say the plan, then maybe just share with us what you have in mind, and then we can discuss that in more detail.
Okay, I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we have a couple there. Sorry, I can't see now. E. Barker, do you want to go for it?
Yes, thank you. I noticed that nowhere in the presentation you even mentioned insurance, and surely at some point you decide on what risks you are prepared to carry yourselves so that you can increase your excess limit and therefore save on insurance. I'd just like your comment on that, please.
So I think traditionally with risk management, they always talk about, well, there are different things, but the 4 T's, you know, there's that treat, terminate, tolerate, and transfer, which is, so when you've got a risk, you know, the transfers, are you going to take insurance out on that? So, you know, that would be my understanding of identifying which risks you can actually manage and which ones you would take insurance out for, and that would then be a control against that particular risk. I have been talking quite a bit to Gert Grijwagen. I don't know if you know Gert, but he's very involved with insurance, you know, risk management and insurance. And, you know, there's always been a drive that you should, if you are demonstrating effective risk management, you should be able to, it should have an influence on premiums and on the way and on your insurance policies. So there's definitely an overlap, but it's a case of, you know, what are the risks that you could insure, and in my mind, that's a particular control.
Thank you.
Okay. Winnie, do you want to go for it?
Sorry, can I just answer that? Okay.
Oh yes, yeah. Please, Stephen.
I just want to answer that the previous Mr. Barker, I think it was. Yeah, look, insurance is a big part of it. I mean, obviously, the aspect of transferring. You know, if you've got you want to transfer some insurance externally, etc., that you don't want to carry yourself, that type of thing, is something you consider in a BCP, obviously, as well. It's just that I didn't cover it in the presentation, but it does come in a lot. It's a major part of the risk, and of course a major part of your BIA. If you identify any areas where you're underinsured, possibly, you need to consider that as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. Winnie, go ask us.
Okay. I think this is to Steve. In an organization setting, who best owns this business continuity plan, or which department or who exactly should it best sit with?
Stephen, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I think what I'm pushing for in what I'm talking about is it needs to be sort of a higher level, at a senior level. So in my opinion, it should be reporting in at a higher level in the business, like risk is. And it should be something that is at executive level, in my opinion. It should be handled there. Otherwise, it's being compartmentalized to a lower level, and it's not seen as being across the business approach. But you may have to convince some people about that.
Thanks. Do you have any other more questions? I don't see any more hands up.
Hi, Jonathan. Sorry, I can't seem to pick my hand up.
Okay.
Here. I just want to put a proposal, maybe, or my idea forward, that I think BCM, because it goes across the whole organization, and therefore it should be probably under the chief risk officer at a very high level. Because BCM is an integral part of risk, in my view. So I think that's where it will be best placed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I do, you know, obviously I I'm probably biased towards enterprise risk management, but I would definitely see BCM as a subset of enterprise risk management. But I think, Stephen, you'd possibly agree with that.
Yes, I would agree with that. Because of the fact that it is across the whole organization. It is like an umbrella view, similar to enterprise risk, but I do agree it's a subset. It does business resilience is a subset of enterprise risk, but organizational resilience isn't really a subset. So depends on how you look at that. Yeah.
All right, do we have any more questions? As I say, we will make this presentation available. We'll send out an email, but we will also stick it. It'll also be on our website within a I don't know, Cheryl, within 1 or 2 days, because we normally do a write-up on it, just a summary of this. And then, if you'd like to engage with us directly, please, you've got both Steve and my email there. Please send us an email if you want to chat about anything, or as we mentioned, for any of those people that are using BarnOwl and you want to see how you would do BIA within BarnOwl, give us a shout, and we can engage with you and see how we can help you. So I'd really like to say thank you again to Stephen for your time today and a great presentation, and wish everyone a very happy Thursday, and hang in there, everyone. We're in for the ride now. There's nothing we can do about this COVID stuff, so we're going to make the most of what we've got, and in many ways, even being able, this is probably our biggest attendance. When we were doing this at our offices, these info sharing sessions, we didn't get over 100. I think we were close to over 100 today. So there are some advantages. There's a silver lining in the cloud every now and again. So thank you very much for your time today, and we will see you at our next info sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.